Welcome to the Dragon's Den. I'm your venerable host, Orochi, and today we are going to continue our adventures in the Impossible Lands, especially the lands of Jelmari, as today we head to their capital city of Niswan. Niswan is a veritable melting pot of all religions and lots of different people, especially genies and genie kin, half-breeds of all different kinds of genies that were once enslaved to make this land a paradise-esque sort of land. They were enslaved to make the rain fall more often, to have better crops, the soil to be better for more crop yield, so that they could be extremely self-sustaining and have all the best of basically what you would think that like high-level druids would do, only better, because genies have a much more deeper connection to the raw elemental forces. And so it sort of also has that history of the genies were enslaved once, and just because they're free now, many genies, live hundreds or thousands of years. Some of them might have been the ones who were enslaved here in the first place, and their children who also bear some of that still reside within these lands as well. So there's a lot of that sort of former slave colony kind of aesthetic going on here. If you want to really look into that, that's definitely an option. And I always think it's good to have darker sorts of story plots that you can lean into if you want to explore that sort of area, and you're in a good group who can do justice to that sort of thing and just hopefully have a cathartic sort of experience with it. And as I pointed out in my previous video, Niswan has a lot of different factions in it. There's a lot of different sort of organizations that are doing drastically different things. Here we have a picture of a curse shepherd, which is a holy group, not entirely religious, but they do view their overall goal in what they do wholeheartedly, in the same way that like the Inquisition did, because there's a lot of those sort of themes with them, because they go around, especially at night, and they kidnap people, specifically people who have been cursed or afflicted with some sort of magical ailment or whatever by any of the more magical folk that live in these lands, like genies and fae, if there's any about, and any of that sort of thing. So that they target people who have been cursed in these different ways, and they kidnap them, and they bring them to one of the specific islands where they basically just have a internment camp. They just put people on the island, make sure that they can't leave, and they just keep stacking people up there. And it's allowed, but sort of in the way that is like, if they didn't allow it, then they would have to deal with a lot of pushback of genies doing all, magical threats and all this and that and other things, and then people being afraid of all the magic people and that sort of stuff. but it's really bad. Like, for most of the things that they kidnap people for, you gotta think there's gotta be some in a land of Jalmere, where, especially Niswan, where they literally have hundreds of different religions. And you've got all these priests of all these different religions. Some of them have to be powerful enough to be able to break curses, right? Like, the idea that there's nobody, no priests of any of these dozens upon dozens of religions that are strong enough to break curses. And I'm sure that, especially with the way that Pathfinder 2's rules work now, most genies, especially being hundreds of years old, their magic is going to be too strong for most priests to break. So there is that, but like being in a position of power and not stopping a renegade group who kidnap people and ship them off to an internment camp, like, that's real bad. That is really, really bad. And in the Impossible Lands, as we've seen so far, and we will continue to see in the next area, almost all of the governments are catastrophically corrupt. That doesn't seem to be the case in Jalmeri so much, because they're probably much more neutral than others just because of the houses of perfection. There are literal schools of martial arts teaching people to be, superhuman combatants, and they hold tons of tournaments to refine these warriors to be way above, human normal capabilities. Like, you could even say like a 5th level person is pretty far above human capabilities just because of the HP they have. But that's sort of what these schools do, is that they raise all these people up, and you got to think that there's a lot of powerful people in this area, so the government would have to work with and around that sort of thing. And if most of the houses of perfection also teach good ethics, being useful to your community and being a good person, stopping evil when you see it, then it has to be hard in Niswan to be a bad person, unless there's just a stream of, whoever the most powerful warrior is, and all of his disciples or whatever are currently jackasses, which is a storyline you can do. But in the grand scheme of things, you would think the majority of the House of Perfection warriors are probably pretty decent people. So that would make it weird that a group like the Cursed Shepherds could exist and they wouldn't have multiple other groups constantly fighting against them, and therefore they would have to be backed by, a lot of money and a lot of zealotry to continue doing what they're doing with so much opposition to it. Because there's also like multiple vigilante groups that are constantly trying to do good in the city, and most of the city guards look the other way as a standing order, because some of them, either the middle or higher ups in the guard and in the military stuff, see that, yeah, these people are doing good that we might not otherwise be able to do because of the laws and stuff, so we give them a pass. So it's kind of like, hey, we're giving these good people a pass because we feel bad that we're also giving these bad people a bit of a pass because there's too much like political bullshit to go through if we did otherwise. It's a very interesting sort of setup where there's a lot of just different forces working in the city, And it doesn't seem like most of the other places in the Impossible Land where the government is corrupt, they just have their hands tied because, what do you do if you outlaw the cursed shepherds and then genies are just going around cursing people and you see all of these people withering and dying and living, hobbled by this magic stuff. And that's a constant reminder that, hey, this could happen at any time. And then what's the city guard doing about that sort of stuff? And it's kind of like they can't actually do much of anything, because if you really tried to pursue arresting and imprisoning one of the genies, then they could easily just unleash a whole crap load of magic on the city and the surrounding area, and that's probably like 10 steps removed from anywhere the city guard wants to start pushing in that area. So it's a very interesting sort of powder keg-ish situation where some of the politicians and like the city, especially like the captain of the city guard and stuff, are trying to balance all of these things so that the people feel safe and good stuff is going on, while also not getting themselves into a situation where people are going to be up in arms about any one thing one way or another. So that's very interesting. Here we have a really cool picture of how the land was just molded into being able to produce a lot of the best sort of farming for their climate, which is super cool. And then I'm just going to go right here and look at the total stats for Niswan as a settlement. Population 10,000. I think this number is pretty low. I will constantly rag on the numbers in this and any future books I cover, because most of, like, I've lived in small towns. I think in my current very small town area, there's like 8,000 people in a small town. It's spread out over a fair amount of distance, but Niswan is fairly well regulated in that, yes, there's dangerous stuff out in the jungles and stuff, but they have, with the city guard and the houses of perfection, it's not like there are really any threats on the island that's going to really be that dangerous to even sort of outlying families that are, peasant families that are working the fields and stuff. So I think for an island nation, that number is maybe sort of okay. I still think it's rather small, but it's not terrible. And it's just a exponential sort of thing where we don't know what the death rates and mortality rates and all that sort of stuff are in Galarian, because that's not something most people think about. But I do think in areas, especially like Niswan, where you've got tons of clerics of all these different gods, that they haven't eradicated most of the like minor causes of death. You can cure so many diseases and so many ailments, and you can heal people when they get injured so they can work better and longer and all this other stuff. Like, having a ton of divine magic to lean on for your culture, like, you have to have a higher birth rate than mortality rate, I would think, like significantly. And so I would think the numbers are constantly going up and should be fairly big. And then I always hate the breakdown because every fucking settlement is like, oh, predominantly human. It's like, why is every single fucking settlement predominantly human? Like, to such a fucktastic degree. 89% human versus 11% other. That's basically, there is one other thing out of like the 10, 20 different ancestries that we have here. Only one per 10 humans. Like, to me, that is just astronomically ridiculous. There's way too many humans all over the frickin' place. I would much rather see humans be like 40 to 60% of a population at most. Especially these places that are supposed to be big mixes of different things. Like, there's supposed to be like a small amount of genies. There's probably, out of 10,000 people, there's probably like a few dozen genies, right? Because most of them left. They didn't want to stay in a place where they were previously enslaved. But then you got to think, all right, well, they live long lives. A bunch of them have probably had a bunch of kids. There's been several generations of that. Plus you have, all these other species that live here as well. And I'm just, I hate the idea that humans have basically done in Galarian what the British and Europeans did in the real world, and like they just went out and colonized everywhere. That's what it feels like, because there's just humans everywhere. It's like, when there's supposed to be so many other creatures and so many other different places, it just feels bad that humans dominate so much everywhere. And I hate that. I much rather have interesting mixes, especially when you're making parties and you're trying to make them feel like they're part of, that population. But we've got several of the big religions here, but there's also a ton more, and they even say like minor gods are born all the time, people who just get ridiculously powerful but then get old and die, even if it takes them like hundreds of years. I think that's pretty cool. Threats: asuras, criminals, crocodiles, cursed shepherds, ocean predators, rakshasas, and wandering martial artists. I love that last one. Just people who are trying to prove themselves and want to start fights with anyone that they see as strong. That's always making great story. Rakshasas are legal to live in Niswan openly, even though they are predominantly evil. But there is laws against most of the things Rakshasas do, and it's like, hey, as long as you don't get caught, you can live here. Just don't get caught doing evil shit. So you can almost always presume every Rakshasa you see is doing some evil shit. They're just in various states of getting away with it. And maybe you could do something about that. There's probably a extremely tiny number that are just getting away with, like, petty crime kind of stuff, and they're fine with that. But, or maybe even you might find a Rakshasa that doesn't really care that much. They're just doing their thing. Ocean predators are fine if you go out, yes. Cursed shepherds are going to be a problem because they kidnap people. Crocodiles, I don't think whoever wrote this in there really knows much about crocodilians. Crocodilians generally aren't a threat to anybody unless you're swimming. If you're swimming, then yes, they might be, but it doesn't seem like there's a lot of waterways in the city, so you'd have to be swimming outside the city, and so I don't think crocodiles would ever be a problem, really. Like, you just shoo them off and they tend to run away because they can't run humanoid creatures down. They just can't really do that. Criminals, which is, that's going to be everywhere. And Asuras, which is like, hey, powerful magical creatures. Then we have a special thing, religious reverence. Niswan reveres champions, clerics, oracles, and monks associated with just about any religion, even most evil religions. Which, that's a cool thing to know, that if you are part of an evil religion, they're like, hey, yeah, you can go here. Don't do any of your evil shit, but you can openly worship and hold festivals and stuff. Just don't break any laws, which is really interesting. Most non-hostile NPCs begin with an attitude one step better than usual towards such characters, for the purpose of determining the availability of divine magic items, divine spellcasting services, and magic items and spellcasting services related to monks. Niswan's settlement level is 20. So that's pretty cool. It's a cool idea, but I think if you have a party that's level 17 or above and you're around Niswan and you're like, oh, hey, your monks can buy stuff and maybe your divine casters can buy all the stuff that they need. Everybody else, you're limited to level 16 stuff. As a balancing thing, that kind of sucks. Like, that's kind of terrible. But there's always problems when you try to mix in flavor with rules. And then we have some of the most notable people here. And no, I shall see if there's any other pictures or anything I want to share. Right there. This is a big holiday that everybody celebrates in Niswan, which is Kite Flying Day, which is really cool. Everybody gets out, shows off their spirit and hopes, and it's just like a giant communal thing, which is super cool. I know that they probably picked this up. There is a few places, I forget where, but I know there's a few places who do this sort of thing, which is, it's nice to have certain things be representative, but not overly so. I don't like when things are just pulled from like Earth history, and it's like, oh, this is these people, and it's like, but how did they become those people? Like, the Assyrians are ancient Egyptians, and it's like, okay, well, how did they become that? And I think the explanation for that in Galarian is that literally the ancient Egyptian gods brought their people here, because the Assyrian gods are literally the ancient Egyptian gods. So that's very strange. But most of the time, I look at things and I'm like, if they're not in a geological area similar to the cultures that they're trying to ape and represent, and they don't have a history extremely similar or identical to the history of that culture, then you can't really say that they would have turned out the same way, and so then they're representative. because they can't be. They would be different based on the different geological and political pressures put upon them. So I always find that kind of, it's cool to be like, hey, there's, my favorite kind of people, or the people that I identify with, and they're represented, and that's cool. But if it doesn't make any sense, then it's kind of like tokenism, where it's like, hey, we put these in just to put them in, not because they actually fit or make any sense here. And I just have problems with that. But I think when you just take like little bits and pieces of them and go like, hey, these people here have this history and it's similar to this history, so they might have picked up some of those traditions, and that's cool. I always like little splashes of similarity instead of like whole cloth kind of stuff. Let's see. I think the rest of this is just on all the different factions and the culture. We got the Challenge of Sky and Heaven, which is their giant fighting tournament, which is kind of interesting that Fist of the Ruby Phoenix took place across the sea from Jalmari, because I don't think it's all that far from them, in the not Japanese lands, where Jalmari has its own tournament, which they could easily make an entire another fighting tournament AP based on this one, which is kind of weird. When and if they actually get around to doing a book on Tianxia, I hope that it really makes a big deal out of the Fist of the Ruby Phoenix tournament, because it's still only held once every 10 years, and there's no mention of other tournaments in the area. There might be in that book that contains information of that area, but here it's a major tourist attraction, and so instead of having it once a year, or it's once every 7 years, the way they phrase it is bizarre. It's the 7th year every 9 years, I think it was, or something. It was stated in the weirdest way, because it's just like, you mean it's every 7 years on a 9-year rotation? Like, that's, I don't know. It's so weird. You just say it's every 9 years. Like, for the first one, it might have been, yeah, they have it on the 7th year, and then 2 years after that, before they start recounting back to the beginning, and it's like, oh, well, then it's just every 9 years. So I don't, like, the way it was written didn't make any sense to me. But because it was such a big tourist attraction, and it brings so many people to the city, and so much trade and all that stuff, they started making a bunch of smaller tournaments to keep that sort of stuff going. So there's a variety of tournaments pretty much all year round of varying sizes and importance. And then here we have the big monasteries. There's the 4 big houses, which are Unblinking Flame, Unbreaking Waves, Unfolding Wind, and Untwisting Iron. There's the symbols for them. Pause that there and look over them. And And then the rest of this, just all the important people in the government. Here we have a nice map. This is the map of the city. And the city is built in such a way that this is the highest point in the city, the Thakar's Palace. And then I think, crap. There's another city that's built in the same way. The capital of Razmadan. Is that what it's called? Or I think it's named after the wizard that owns it, Razmadan. Something like that. But Razmadan is built on like the 12 steps or whatever, and the city just has different shelf layers as you go down. And this is built in a similar kind of way, where you have, this is the highest point, and then this ring out here is a little bit lower, and then this ring here is a little bit lower, and a little bit lower, and a little bit lower, and a little bit lower. Which I don't think I've ever actually seen a place built like that, or at least haven't seen pictures of any place built like that. It's sort of like, I guess they tried to do that in the Lord of the Rings movies with like the Ivory Palace or whatever it was, the White Citadel, where they had, you know, this sloping, tiered sort of build, but there was just giant walls everywhere, so it didn't really have that sort of feel to it. It just looked weird. So I'm not sure, unless there's just like lots of natural, like this is just a natural mountain, like a small mountain, and they carved into it. Then otherwise, I'm not sure if building in that sort of way where everything goes up is really all of that interesting. I'm sure there's places in Europe that are like that, because I've seen plenty of movie scenes and stuff where there's just these lots of big slopes, but that makes, is the whole thing just sloped, or is there actually tiers, like shelving tiers? And I don't think anyone has really built shelf tiers that much, because it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, especially just for buildings. Whereas like if the hill is predominantly used as, you know, farmlands, then that makes more sense. But I don't know. Don't have a lot of experience with that sort of thing. I think that is the last good picture we're gonna get. There's a cool recipe here for Zafrini chai saffron tea. I absolutely love that they add in some like local culinary stuff that's just adds so much flavor. Get it? Flavor to the, at least some of the people that live in the area. And we got all the important people. Here's a good picture of this parts of the city. So we do have water in the city, but from that big picture of it, there wasn't any like massive like riverway or anything. And it shows here that they got boats, so that they're getting around by boat, but I don't know, that other picture didn't really seem like that was a big thing. So maybe aqueduct kind of stuff is pretty big in the city, but I don't know. That is about all the light skimming I'm going to do in it. There's a lot to read on all the different factions, all the important people that are heads of these factions or work with them or have important roles in the city. And having these deep write-ups of cities like this, I think is fantastic, so that you can actually just have your characters go into the city and have it feel like an actual place you're exploring, instead of just, hey, this is a big city, find the magic shop, buy some stuff, visit the local priest to cure your stuff, and then go back out adventuring. It just, you can stay there for a little while, if especially if your group is heavy into roleplay, you can stay there and just feel immersed with all of this information that you have. And that's fantastic. Even if most groups never make any use of this stuff, I think it's just fantastic to have this, because compared to like D&D, probably like what, 5 cities maybe, and that's about it. The whole map is predominantly open, and you know that there's all these different places, but there's hardly any stories set in them. There's no books really describing all of these places. So these books are just fantastic. Hopefully there's a good number of groups that are getting fantastic use out of them. But that is all for today. Have a great evening.